In this video, we're going to be converting more enemies from Destiny 2 into D&D. Somewhat recently, the new expansion for Destiny 2 called The Final Shape has released, and along with that expansion comes a whole new slew of enemy types for the game. So I'm going to be converting those enemies, the Dread, the Witness's Forces, into stat blocks in D&D. And as usual, I'll be putting them up on screen for you to pause and read if you would like, and also there will be links in the description to these on D&D Beyond. So first up is the Attendant. The Attendant is basically a stasis-wielding scion. There are two scions as part of the Witness's Forces. There's the Attendant and the Weaver. The Attendant does stasis and the Weaver does strand. And this first one is going to be the stasis version. So the stat block is a challenge rating of 5, fairly middle of the road to like early in D&D campaigns as far as a monster that you would face. And going into the features, the first feature it has here is a new one that I made, and this feature you'll actually see show up on all of my stat blocks here. However, I do want to talk about this one specifically because it is a bit of a unique one. So the feature is paracausal. So what the feature basically does is when you use this feature on a monster, you pick from a list of 6 different symbols of power, or you roll on it randomly if you would like, and that creature gains the benefit of that symbol of power, and that is that creature's symbol of power. Now, this is meant to be somewhat of a recreation or a smaller version of the symbols that you see appear in the Final Shape campaign, as well as in the Vow of the Disciples raid where we first saw them. There are quite a few, I think more than 20 symbols as part of that set of symbols, and some are updated in the new expansion, but this feature takes 6 of them, Dark, Pyramid, Kill, Worship, Traveler, and Light, and those are the callouts people use in game. And I'm using these 6 symbols as different small buffs to a monster. And these buffs all are pretty decent and pretty generally applicable. However, you might notice that 3 of them are dark affinity buffs, so Dark, Pyramid, and Kill, and 3 of them are like light affinity buffs, Worship, Traveler, and Light. And they function somewhat of like mirror abilities. So 2 is Pyramid, and it lets you emit an aura that gives a disadvantage on Wisdom, Intelligence, and Charisma saving throws to enemies nearby. And 5, which is sort of the opposite number if we think of this as like a mirror between 3 and 4, 5 is Traveler and does the exact opposite of that. It gives advantage on Wisdom, Intelligence, and Charisma saving throws to nearby allies. So 1 through 3 are more dark affinity, and 4 through 6 are more light affinity. And their symbols represent that. Employing these symbols in your game through this feature is sort of a good foot in the door to using this feature as a way to apply some new mechanics to whatever dungeon or area you've put these enemies in. I don't know how many of you guys actually use these monster stat blocks that I put out, but I would imagine if you're using them, you're likely using them all in somewhat of the same area of your world, since they're all pretty relevant to each other. So the idea here is to give you a sort of a neat way to do some light mechanics that you could take a step further as the DM if you would like. You know, you could put a puzzle in your game that requires some of these symbols of power that they get from killing monsters, or from other ways if you have other ways you want to incorporate these symbols. And you could go through the symbols that are in Destiny as well, the other like 20 plus symbols, and convert those into small buffs for your game too. The idea being here that this is introducing somewhat of a new mechanic through these monsters that you could employ and take further in your game if you would really like to. And if I was to use these in my game, which I probably will, that is likely how I would incorporate this, is I would take these symbols and use them for different puzzles or like world building, or some way to use them in the game that's a bit more interesting even outside of combat. So that's the paracausal feature, and it's a pretty long and chunky feature. And I would say, frankly, it's pretty optional. None of these stat blocks require this paracausal feature to function properly, and the buffs that get here are very generally applicable. So moving from there, the other feature we have here is stasis. This feature explains that this creature, this Attendant, is capable of applying points of slowed to targets. And this is very much an adaptation of stasis from Destiny 2. It states that while you have points of slowed, your movement speed is reduced by 5 feet for each point, and your armor class is reduced by 1 for each point. And you lose these points at the start of your turn, a minimum of 1 point lost at the start of each of your turns, but that number goes up if you have a higher Constitution modifier. And then to compound on that, if you get 7 or more points of slowed at once, You lose all of your points of slowed, but become frozen, which makes you paralyzed until the end of your next turn. So a pretty nasty feature that applies a pretty bad debuff to the enemies of the Attendant, if it hits them with these points. But let's now move to its actions and see what it can do. So it has a triple multi-attack it can do with its ranged weapon, and that does a bit of damage, but it also applies 1 point of slowed to the target if they get hit by it. But further than that, it also has a Frost Pulse, which is a 15-foot cone AoE that applies a decent bit of cold damage, but also applies points of slowed, 4 if they fail their saving throw and 2 if they succeed. So that is going to be the main attack for applying points of slowed for the Attendant if it wants to. But it also has a reaction, Winter's Dodge. This is essentially a parry that the Attendant can do and add 2 to its armor class to make an attack miss. And if this parry does work, if it does make the attack miss, any hostile creatures within 10 feet of the Attendant gain 1 point of slowed. And the Attendant gets to move up to its movement speed away without provoking opportunity attacks. And so if you couldn't tell, this Winter's Dodge reaction is basically the Hunter's Dodge that it can do with the Touch of Winter aspect in Destiny 2. And that's a trend you're going to see for a few of the other upcoming monsters here, is I've taken some abilities that the Guardians of Destiny 2 can do and put them on these monsters, because the monsters in Destiny 2 don't have a ton of different things they can do with their stasis and strand and whatever abilities, but the Guardians do, and so I brought some of those over to these monsters. So moving on from the Attendant, we'll take a look at its like twin brother here, the Weaver, which is basically the same creature except for it uses strand instead of stasis. So again, the paracausal feature, but now the strand feature instead of stasis. The strand feature, instead of afflicting targets with points of slowed, afflicts them with points of severed. For each point of severed that a creature has, its outgoing damage is reduced by 2 or 1d4 for each point. And in this case, losing these points at the start of your turn is again a minimum of 1, but it scales up with your wisdom modifier. And like stasis, if you have 7 or more points at one time, an effect triggers. In this case, you get suspended, which causes you to be restrained, and you can attempt to break free of that restraint with saving throws at the end of your turns. So probably a little bit less deadly than the slowed from stasis, as when that builds up, it paralyzes you. Granted, that only does that for 1 round, whereas this is a continual save. But because this is a little bit weaker than that, this Weaver is going to have a little bit more ways to apply that severed. So it can make 3 attacks with a ranged weapon like the other one can, but it can also replace 2 of those attacks with something called a Weaver's Dart. This dart, when thrown at a target, if the target fails their saving throw, this dart will then ricochet to another target within a certain distance and will continue to ricochet up to 4 times, or until someone actually succeeds on their save and doesn't get damaged by the dart. And the dart only does these negative effects if you fail the saving throw, in which case you take a little bit of damage and gain a bunch of severed, 4 points of severed. The Weaver also has a bonus action Rebound. This is something that it can do in Destiny 2. It chooses a large or smaller creature it can see within 60 feet, and then it flings them across the battlefield. And when it does so, if the target makes contact with an object that's in its path, such as like a wall or a tree or something it can't move, it takes damage when colliding with that object as if it was falling. So the falling rules in D&D are a d6 per 10 feet of falling. So in this case, the target takes 3 or 1d6 damage for every 10 feet that it goes before hitting that object. So Rebound is somewhat of a movement, a forced movement ability on the Weaver's part for an enemy, but it can also be a damaging ability if the Weaver has something it can throw the person into. And then it has a reaction here called Threaded Spectre, which is another hunter ability that's been taken over here. So this also functions as a parry, except for in this case, if the parry works and blocks the attack, the Weaver creates an illusory duplicate of itself in its space, and then it teleports to another space nearby. And if a creature ends its turn too close to the duplicate or makes contact with it, the duplicate explodes into a bunch of strand energy that deals damage to nearby creatures. So functioning basically the same as those threaded specters that you see hunters make in Destiny 2. So the Attendant and the Weaver are the 2 like low-level strand and stasis wielding enemies in Destiny 2. However, they have 2 versions of themselves that are a bit higher level or more difficult. There's also an enemy type called a subjugator, which is like a bigger version of those two and can be in an Omen or a Harbinger version, which is stasis and strand respectively, and are basically just upgraded versions. So that's what we're going to do here, is take a look at a couple upgraded versions. So the Omen is the stasis version. So the stats here are a little bit more beefed up and higher level. It has the paracausal and stasis features. Those have not changed. It has a multi-attack that lets it make 3 attacks with either a ranged weapon or melee weapon. The ranged weapon attack applies points of slowed to its targets, and the melee weapon attack lets the Omen knock a target back away from it. However, it can drop 2 out of those 3 attacks to replace that with a action called Stasis Invocation. This allows the Omen to create 5 stasis crystals in unoccupied spaces around the battlefield nearby, and they have an armor class and hit points. The idea here being that it also has a different action it can use on its turn called Shatter. Shatter will cause all of the stasis crystals near the Omen in a wide radius to detonate and explode, and respectively each have their own small radius explosions centered around themselves that do cold damage and apply slowed points. So notably, the Stasis Invocation and Shatter are both actions, and the Shatter is not included as part of the multi-attack, so this is a ability that requires some setup, right? The Stasis Invocation doesn't actually do anything on its own. The Shatter action is required to make use of the Stasis Invocation. So this is sort of a 2-turn setup that the Omen has to do, which is why the damage and radius of the shatters is pretty good. As a bonus action, the Omen can create a Dusk Field. This is the Dusk Field Grenade from Destiny 2. It's a recharge ability, and it creates a 20-foot radius sphere of Dusk Field, of winter basically. And this area is dim light, and it's also difficult terrain. And when a creature enters that area for the first time on their turn, starts their turn, or ends their turn there, in any of those scenarios, they gain 2 points of slowed. So a pretty devastating field, and it applies slowed very easily, so players got to be very careful of it, and it's difficult terrain, so if this is placed right on top of you, you could easily find yourself spending an extra turn there. And then the Omen has the Winter's Dodge reaction again, which is the same one the Attendant had, except for this one does give a slight bit better bonus to the armor class to try and defend with, and it also can apply more points of slowed than the Attendant's version. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Harbinger, which is the Strand version. Again, beefier stats here, though not quite as beefy as the Omen. It has the Paracausal and Strand feature, the same as the Weaver. However, it does have a new feature here called Threadlings. You may be familiar with Threadlings if you've played Destiny 2. It's something that all of the Guardians can take advantage of. This feature makes it so that anytime an attack roll misses the Harbinger gets to gain 1 Threadling, up to a maximum of 7 of them. And it states that when the Harbinger deals force damage, it can expend these Threadlings to apply 5 or 1d10 additional force damage to the damage, and use those Threadlings up. So basically just a improvement to the damage dealing capabilities of the Harbinger, but only if people are missing attacks on it. And something I like about this feature is that it does technically scale up with more enemies. So it is kind of a way for the Harbinger to get a little bit more powerful and a little bit more potent adaptively based on how many enemies are fighting it, because more than likely, more attacks are going to be missed on it when it's fighting more enemies. The Harbinger has a multi-attack that lets it make 3 attacks with any combination of its Threaded Blast and Abeyant Lash, the Threaded Blast being a ranged weapon attack that can apply some Severed, and the Abeyant Lash being a line attack that's a 30-foot line that's 5 feet wide. And this is a bit unique because this line attack can be used as part of the multi-attack. You could technically make 3 line attacks here if you wanted to with the Harbinger, which is not something you see very often. This line attack deals a decent bit of damage and applies points of Severed, but notably another neat portion of this line attack is that the Harbinger can actually spend Threadlings to double the width of the line. 2 Threadlings to be exact. So it can use up 2 of those Threadlings and make the width be a 10-foot wide line attack. It has the same rebound bonus action that the Weaver had. However, notably here, the rebound is quite a bit better as it can choose up to 3 larger, smaller creatures instead of just 1. And then it has the same Threaded Spectre reaction, but like with the Omen, this reaction has been improved above the original version, giving a slight bit more armor class bonus. but also it allows the Harbinger to teleport further, and the explosion the clone makes is in a wider radius. Okay, so those were 4 strand and stasis wielding stat blocks that have some fair variety to their skills and are decently strong. I'm going to now cover 2 a little bit lower challenge rating and a bit weaker monsters here, and then we'll get into our final one, which is a much stronger enemy that you might be pretty familiar with if you play the game. So this next stat block is for the Husk. Now the Husks are a melee enemy introduced with this expansion, and the Husks are a unique one in that they have a crit spot on their stomach, and if you don't kill them using that crit spot, then they release a secondary enemy that seeks you out and tracks you down and explodes on you doing damage. So looking at the stat block here, the Husk is a pretty low level monster with low level stats. It does have the paracausal feature like the others, but it also has 2 new features, Geist and Weak Point. So Geist here is explaining exactly what I just explained. The Husk has a Geist within it that has 1 HP and 10 AC, and when the Husk dies, the Geist will instantaneously burrow out and seek out the nearest enemy creature and try to explode, dealing some fire damage on a failed save. And this kills the Geist when it makes this attack. Now the other feature here explains sort of the counter to that. The Husk has a weak point on its stomach, and a creature can target that weak point, adding a +5 bonus to the AC of the Husk when they make the attack. And if they hit the Husk with this targeted attack, it is a critical hit. And if the Husk dies from this attack, the Geist in its stomach dies along with it, basically nullifying that Geist feature if you hit it this way. So functionally, if your players are aware of this feature, this Geist feature that the Husk has, then the Husk actually has a 20 armor class if they're trying to kill it that way. Now they could just kill it and let the Geist come out, and that's a viable strategy, but it makes this monster a little bit more interesting because there is that sort of trade-off you have to make there. And then the Husk has a pretty standard melee weapon attack, and then it also has a bonus action Nimble Escape, where it can take the dash, disengage, or hide action as a bonus action. And the other low-level monster I made here is the Grim. The Grim is a flying like bat or winged dragon type creature in the expansion, and it just kind of fires and shoots its gun at you, but it also has a unique ability where it screeches and it applies suppress to you. It suppresses you from using your abilities or double jumping and all those types of things. So looking at the stat block I've made here, it has pretty low creature stats. It's only challenge rating 2. It has the paracausal feature again, but it also has a new feature called Suppress. And this one's pretty important because it's going to be a big component of the final monster we're going to be talking about here. So similar to the Strand and Stasis features, Suppress applies creatures with points of Suppressed. While afflicted by the points of Suppressed, a creature becomes unable to use spells and class abilities of a level equal to its points of Suppressed or lower. The example given here is that a sorcerer with 2 points of Suppressed would be unable to use its Font of Magic, its first level sorceress origin features, or cast any second level or lower spells. And then I also note that it does not reduce anything like ability scores or hit points or proficiencies, so you don't have to like reduce your hit points down or anything like that from a suppression like this. And then you lose your points of Suppressed at the start of your turn like the other 2, minimum of 1, except for in this case, you can lose more than that if you have a higher intelligence modifier, which is a little uniquely brutal because most classes don't prioritize intelligence in D&D. And then finally, if your suppression points reach a point at which it's greater than or equal to half of your character level and or challenge rating, you lose all points of Suppressed and gain 1 level of exhaustion. Which the first time you gain that might not be that big of a deal, but the further you get down the points of or levels of exhaustion chain, the more and more deadly that can become, and ultimately proving to be deadly if you get 6 levels of exhaustion. So a bit of a interesting and brutal feature here. I find it very neat, but I will also admit that it can probably be, or I can see scenarios where it would be a little bit confusing in game. So this is going to be something that I tried as best as I could to word it in a way that was clear, but there are probably going to be scenarios that come up. Undoubtedly, if you use this a lot, there would be a scenario that might come up where you're like, does that count? Can I use that if I'm suppressed? How does that work? And so to that, I would say, rule of cool, like use your best reasoning as a DM. I would say if you're in doubt, probably just let them use it because this ability is pretty brutal. I mean, Most classes in D&D are front-loaded. That's why multi-classing is so good, because most of the good stuff you get as a class comes at the beginning, not later. So things like Action Surge, Second Wind, Font of Magic allowing you to use sorcery points, all of these types of things come early on. So as you build up points of suppress here, you're going to lose access to those things while you have these points. So pretty brutal, but also kind of interesting because players aren't really put in that type of a scenario very often. So you might see a lot of creative ideas come up from players when they are unable to use those things, or they might just start swinging away with standard attacks. But I will say that keep this suppressed feature in mind when balancing encounters, especially when we get to our next stat block, because I would actually maybe put creatures with this feature a little bit higher on the challenge rating scale, because it can be a little bit of an unknown when people get suppressed and what that will do to them. So the Grim also has a multi-attack with a ranged weapon attack, and it has a bonus action, Screech, which applies said points of suppressed. So let's move on to talking about our final stat block for this video. And this one is a bit of a higher level stat block. It is a legendary creature. And this one is a dread enemy that we've actually had access to for a little bit longer than this new expansion, because it was introduced prior to, and that is the Tormentor. So looking at the Tormentor here, it has pretty high stats, 20 armor class, 310 hit points, and a pretty high challenge rating. And again, I think I put that challenge rating maybe a little bit higher than you might expect, because it does have the suppress feature here. So looking at the features, it does have paracausal and suppress, and it also has weak point, which was on the Husk, except for in this case, it's a little bit different. The weak point here gives the Tormentor 2 weak points, 1 on each of its shoulders. And again, like the Husk, it's a +5 bonus to its armor class if you want to make a targeted attack against that weak point. If you hit that with the attack, then it bypasses any of the Tormentor's damage resistances and immunities, and it is a critical hit. However, once you deal damage to a weak point, you can't deal damage to it again, it's destroyed. However, notably at the bottom of the weak point feature, it does say that if both of the Tormentor's weak points are destroyed, its armor class is reduced by 5. So this is sort of a challenge to the players to try and hit these weak points and get the benefits of that, being that you get a guaranteed critical if you can hit it. But also, just like in Destiny 2, once you break both of those shoulders, it becomes much easier to damage the Tormentor because it becomes open to damage on like its entire torso. So in this case, we're representing that with a lowering of its armor class. And the other new feature here that the Tormentor has is Sacrificial Resilience. This is basically legendary resistance, except for it's not limited to a certain amount of times per day. It can do this once per saving throw as many times as it wants. However, the limitation is that it needs to pick a hostile creature within 60 feet that has points of suppressed, and it needs to remove that creature's suppressed points in order to do this legendary resistance, basically. So it has to actually assist an enemy or give something up that it probably put on the battlefield in order to make this new attempt at the saving throw. The Tormentor has a multi-attack that allows it to make 3 attacks with any combination of its ranged weapon and melee weapon attack. Both of these attacks apply points of suppressed. However, the melee weapon attack can also be a grapple on a creature if the Tormentor would like. And then it also has an action called Redactive Eruption. This is a recharge ability, and it allows the Tormentor to leap in the air and then land at a point it can see within 30 feet. And it causes an explosion within a 60-foot radius around it, so a quite big AoE for this attack. However, in addition to the massive damage that it deals, it also applies points of suppressed to the targets. As a bonus action, the Tormentor has the Null Paroxysm. This is once per day, and it summons a black hole above the Tormentor that shoots out waves of force damage energy at targets that it can see. And it does that at the end of every hostile creature in initiative's turn. So that's a unique aspect to this ability. This ability is concentration, so the Tormentor does need to concentrate on it, but at the end of every hostile creature's turn in initiative, it's going to be shooting out one of those waves with a +12 to hit that deals force damage and applies suppressed when it hits. So I would consider Null Paroxysm to be somewhat of the signature Tormentor ability from Destiny 2 when it shoots out those little void waves above it. And I would also say this is its most powerful ability here on its stat block, but it is only once per day and is concentration, so the Tormentor could lose it quite easily. But while it's up, it does quite a bit of damage, and that damage scales the more hostile creatures are in combat with the Tormentor. And then the Tormentor does have 2 legendary actions that it can take. The first is Dark Harvest. This allows the Tormentor to basically damage and siphon a little bit of energy or temporary hit points from a creature that it has grappled, which it can grapple with one of its melee attacks, but it can also attempt to make a grapple as part of this legendary action. If the creature fails its saving throw, it takes some damage, it gains some points of suppressed, but it also has its ability scores reduced by 2 until its next short or long rest, and that's all of its ability scores. So that can be pretty dangerous, especially if a creature is being targeted consistently by this Dark Harvest, which, if the Tormentor gets you grappled, then it could be quite easy for the Tormentor to use all of its legendary actions to continue to do this. And so this might actually be a scenario in which I would say typically players don't attempt to break grapples or get their allies out of grapples unless they know the monster can like eat them or something. But in this case, the monster isn't eating them, but it is doing quite a bit with its legendary actions to them and making life difficult for them if they stay in that grapple. And also notably, when the Tormentor uses this Dark Harvest, it gains temporary hit points equal to the damage dealt by the attack. And then the other legendary action it has here is Nova Warp. This costs 2 actions and lets the Tormentor teleport 60 feet, but it also leaves behind a black hole in its space where it was, which emits a 20-foot radius sphere of difficult terrain. And creatures that end their turn in that area gain 2 points of suppressed. And this area lasts until the start of the Tormentor's next turn, but the Tormentor also gets teleport as part of that. So it is a multi-purpose legendary action. So those were all the stat blocks I had for you in this video, converting dread enemies from Destiny 2 into D&D. If there are other video game monsters you guys would like to see converted into D&D stat blocks, let me know, especially since I get to use these stat blocks in my game too. So I'm always on the lookout for new ideas. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.